We're back. Thank you for bearing with us. It wouldn't be a proper DC meeting without some technical difficulties, right? We are. So it's definitely a resilient crowd. Thanks for bearing with us. So let me just move right into making some introductions. Our speakers today are going to include Tiffany Griffin, who's the Advisor for Monitoring and Evaluation and Strategic Analysis with the USAID Center for Resilience. Also, Sarah Henley Shepard, who's the Senior Advisor for Climate Change and Resilience with Mercy Corps. We're also joined by Brad Chagaro, who's the Senior Researcher for Resilience with Mercy Corps, and Tim Frankenberger, the President of Tango International. Also wanted to introduce John Kurtz. John won't be presenting today, but John is the Director for Research and Learning at Mercy Corps, and he's certainly had a role in putting these guidance materials together. So, Greg Collins, yes, thank you. Greg, you snuck in afterwards, yes. Also will not be presenting today, but as the Director for the Center for Resilience with USAID, he's had a really prominent role in not only resilience policy and programming within AID, but with this award in particular. So thanks for joining us, Greg. Also, I'll acknowledge Mark Fritzler, the Director of the TOPS program. Thank you very much for joining us, Mark. Before we get started, I just also want to acknowledge those of you who submitted questions through the registration for this event. Thank you very much. They've been very helpful in organizing today's session. I think you'll see that today that the sessions have been designed to respond to many of those questions. Not all, but we expect to get more questions today. And in addition to the answers that the speakers are able to provide today, I think the questions themselves are going to be very helpful going forward. Our webinar team is going to be facilitating all the questions and input from those joining us online. And then finally, just in terms of summarizing some of the questions that we've already had, I want to just request that you continue to jot down questions, save them until we get to the question and answer period, because we'll kind of compile and prioritize those. And thus far, what we've really seen are some general questions about resilience and shock measurement. We'll certainly be responding to those. We've received another area of questions around planning for resilience measurement throughout the project life cycle. So that's also an important topic that will be discussed today. There's been another series of questions about multi-scale aspects of resilience measurement, from the individual to the household, community, and higher systems level measurement of resilience. So these are all some topics that will be touched on today. We are not going to get into very technical reads of resilience measurement today, of the details of doing that. There are other guidance materials available for that, and we'll have other learning events dedicated to that. And we're not going to focus on sector-specific questions about resilience measurement, although that'll be addressed in part today. So thank you very much, and with that, I'll welcome Tiffany.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tiffany Griffin, and I head up the M&E and Strategic Analytics work for the Center for Resilience at USAID. I'm just going to give a brief overview of the series. Next slide, please. And really, I want to emphasize that this is USAID's current approach to resilience measurement. This isn't the be-all, end-all. We're not trying to be comprehensive and review all of the resilience measurement approaches. And then similarly, we're giving you a little taste of the guidance series with the hopes that you all will read it once you leave this session. Next slide, please. So when you guys think of resilience measurement, what do you think of? Perhaps this? Or maybe that, intense boredom, right? Or maybe the apocalypse, right? Well, our goal with this measurement series was to make you think of visions like this. Right? The good things in life, puppies, we wanted to be relaxing, happy, unicorns, beaches. We didn't want intimidation, chocolate, one of my favorite things. Right? We wanted to have you guys really approach the resilience measurement process with joy, not trepidation, with ease and excitement. So that was our ultimate objective. Next slide. So the 5 guidance notes that we'll be highlighting today are on risk and resilience assessments, measuring shocks, measuring resilience capacities, conducting resilience analyses, and resilience measurement at the activity or project level. That 5th, oh, okay. No problem. The 5th guidance note mentioned there is in process, so we'll just talk about it very, very, very briefly, but it will be ready by the end of next month. Mercy Corps was the lead writer in the consortium on this guidance note series in partnership with Tango and the Center for Resilience. We designed it to be a series. We wanted to take this big topic and break it down into digestible pieces. So hence the 5 guidance notes as opposed to just one gigantic guidance note. And then our plan is to, as we engage with the users of the guidance notes, to revisit them annually-ish, to revise them given the learning and the engagement that we have with the field. The series is also complemented by other products like an online measurement e-module series, which there's information on outside of this room, and then also perhaps we can include the resources, the one-pager as resources after the event, and then in-person workshops. Next slide. So why did we produce this series? There was and is a ton of demand for resources on resilience measurement. The demand is coming from mission staff, USAID Washington implementing partners. We also wanted to clear up myths that it's super onerous, really complicated, really time-consuming, really resource-intensive. It can be, but it need not be. And so we wanted to clarify. We wanted to, like I mentioned, illustrate options given kind of where folks are in their resource base for conducting this work. And we wanted to dialogue with the field, iterate, figure out what needs this does meet, and then what gaps still remain so that we can continue to respond to demand in the future. Next slide. So with that, thank you. We'll turn it over to Sarah to start, and let's be fearless as we approach.
Thank you, Tiffany. So I can't look at the audience. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Henley-Shepard, Senior Advisor for Climate Change and Resilience at Mercy Corps. It's my pleasure to introduce the first guidance note on risk and resilience assessment. So this first note really walks us through what the purpose of a resilience assessment is and how it's different from standard risk and vulnerability assessments. It also walks us through how to plan, design, execute, and strategically use the results to inform program design, country strategies, program strategies, and really design and execute interventions in a different way. So why should we do a resilience assessment? Because we live in a complex, dynamic, and interconnected world, we really need to understand the context in which we're doing humanitarian aid, early recovery, and development work. And so to do this, we really need to understand the systems at play, the dynamics within the systems and across the systems, as well as the complex factors leading to underlying conditions, systemic constraints, and what's driving shocks and stresses that people are faced with every day. This process of increasing our understanding about the resilience and the dynamics of systems is really important to change how we're doing humanitarian and development work, to better understand how to support people's resilience capacities to deal with the shocks and the stresses that they're facing. One example in the previous slide, as we can see, one example that we can see in Northeast Nigeria, where we're doing a strategic resilience assessment with Mercy Corps for the first time in a complex crisis setting, is that assessments need to be flexible. We need to adapt to the different access issues, security issues, and time constraints that we may have. And so this guidance note provides a template basically for you to adapt future resilience assessments that are flexible given the level of effort, time constraints, and access issues. In addition, they may require different types of engagement. Resilience assessments inform transformational learning just as much as they inform new outputs like theories of change, systems maps, and so forth. And so the process of conducting a resilience assessment is just as important as the products that come from that assessment itself. Next slide. So what's different about a resilience assessment? As mentioned, it enables us to really look at the system dynamics within social, economic, and ecological systems and understand how they're interacting, what the underlying conditions of vulnerability and risk are, to really allow for transformational entry points for building resilience. This also helps us understand how conditions are changing over time and space, and what our entry points for building resilience are. They're also usually less quantitative than some of the metrics that will be discussed later on in further presentations. They involve mixed methods approaches, including participatory role appraisal techniques, like was done in Northeast Nigeria, where we're really able to do research that is less extractive and more empowering and participatory, doing community risk and resource mapping, focus group discussions, key informant interviews. And a lot of that can be triangulated and combined with panel data and with geospatial information. But assessments are all about landscape scale, broader picture, and understanding contextual dynamics. The other difference is that we're not just focusing on vulnerability and exposure. We're focusing on resilience capacities. And with this contextual understanding, we're able to really hone in on the absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacities that people, communities, and systems really need to transcend these shocks and stresses without compromising their development and well-being outcomes. Next slide. So that's great. What does it take to do a resilience assessment? So we've provided a matrix to really inform what are the different trade-offs of doing resilience assessment depending on the level of effort, the purpose of the assessment, the scope, the scale, as well as the capital that you have available to you and the human resources. And so although a rapid assessment by humanitarian standards isn't usually going to take 5 to 10 weeks, that's really what we're saying is the minimum standard for doing a resilience assessment. And here we lay out the different opportunities for what that could entail as far as what scope and scale it could cover. So a shorter term assessment could really focus on a few sectors in a smaller geographic area, but it would still give you a better sense for the system dynamics and the context and the shocks and stresses that people are facing, whereas a more resource-intensive, longer-term assessment would provide you greater detail on these systems. Okay. So how can they work? So also in the guidance note, we lay out a process. Again, this is not meant to be prescriptive. This is meant to be an adaptable platform from which you can create your own assessments. But within the planning and design phase, again, it helps the assessment team, which we also provide guidance for how to create and compose an assessment team, convenes and really lays out what the outputs and outcomes are that are desired. What are the knowledge gaps that exist? How much data is there to collect, both secondary and primary data, and what level of effort can the effort support? And so based on this, the research plan is devised, the team is composed, and roles and responsibilities are clarified. Ideally, this team will be composed of not just internal institutional folks, but also folks from the field to support transformational learning, thought partners, donors, and so forth. The idea of a resilience assessment is really to transcend these sector-focused, institutional-based risk assessments and share the learnings and the process with the aid and development community writ large. This is followed by data collection, again, a combination of secondary literature review data as well as primary data collected in the field. And again, usually through mixed methods and qualitative measures. The really important piece to this is the interactive analysis. It's not meant to be done in a room far away from everyone else. It's meant to be done in workshops where field staff, where headquarters staff, where thought partners and donors are able to really interact with the data, push back on findings that don't quite make sense with what they're seeing on the front lines or what they're seeing in other data sources, and offer an opportunity for them to learn together and to push the research agenda forward together. And this is followed by formulation of a resilience strategy based on the results. Next slide. So what can I show us? So some of you may have seen this graphic before. What a resilience assessment enables us to do is walk through an iterative process of these very important questions. So resilience for whom helps us hone in on the vulnerable population, understand why there is differential vulnerability, and look at the different attributes like their demographics, their location, their livelihoods, and so forth. Resilience of what helps us understand what are the systems at play, what are the dynamics like, what are the underlying conditions that are really compromising people's ability to achieve well-being and development outcomes, and what are the resilience to what are the shocks and stresses that people are facing, how are they interacting with the systems, how are they interacting with each other, and then resilience through what is really focusing on the capacities that people need to deal in the short, mid, and long term so that they don't have compromised well-being outcomes, which gets us a fifth question, resilience to what end? What we want to understand is what does it take as far as building people's capacities to deal with shocks and stresses so that they don't have reduced nutritional security and food security and human security. Next slide. So we can use the results in a variety of ways. As with the Northeast Nigeria Strategic Resilience Assessment example, this can inform a broader Northeast Nigeria resilience strategy writ large. It can help pivot and redirect a lot of humanitarian and development work to think in ways that would actually support resilience building over time. It would also give us a lens into understanding if we're undermining resilience through humanitarian and development intervention. In addition, it enables us to address big knowledge gaps, places where there is a lot of data paucity, data scarcity, and it's difficult to understand if you're making an impact in building resilience without data. That's where resilience assessments can really come in and fill that gap. And ultimately, it influences research agendas and monitoring and evaluation frameworks to really help people understand, are we moving the mark, are we moving the needle on building people's resilience through our humanitarian and development interventions? It provides contextual decision-making tools which support that process. And again, it supports transformational learning for all of us as partners facing very complex issues. It enables us to look at things from a different resilience angle. Next slide. So just very quickly, here are two examples of products. This is a systems map, and you can see different system dynamics interacting, underlying conditions leading to shocks and stresses on livelihoods, sectors, and populations. And this helps us see what are our entry points for reducing people's exposure and vulnerability to shocks and stresses. Next slide. This is also another product, but also a learning process tool, which is a theory of change. Here we can see development objectives are directly threatened by certain shocks and stresses. This also enables us to build in resilience thinking into our program design or research design, and even within our policies to understand how can we support people to have the capacities that they need and access and use them to better deal with shocks and stresses without compromising their well-being. But it also enables us to identify how can we operationally be more resilient to the shocks and stresses ourselves, because if our operations are failing, then we're not able to get life-saving, life-sustaining services to those who need it most. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Oh, cool. I'll go ahead and get started while we're managing the technical stuff. But my name is Brad Segara. I'm with Mercy Corps, and my work focuses on resilience measurement and resilience research. And so this is the fun, lighthearted segment of the event where we talk about measuring all the terrible things that happen to people. And today I'm going to talk about why we measure those things, how we might go about incorporating them into our M&E and research plans. And I'll start to touch on some of the analytical approaches, but I think Tiffany is really going to cover that in her segment of the presentation. So next slide, please. All right, so how many in the room have seen this map before, by show of hands? Okay, so there's a handful of people who have seen this map before. So I want to use this as a means of getting at why we would measure. So who can tell me, take a moment to think about this map and what it's showing, and what do you kind of observe in this particular map? Like what jumps out at you as kind of, what is this telling you? Anyone have anything? I'm going to start calling on people if they don't. Okay, so it's measuring drought, yes. Okay, but what about it? So there's some variation, right? So we have some areas that are blue, we have some areas that are orange, yellow, red, okay?
So we know that shocks can be, they affect areas very differentially, right? So some areas are just fine, some areas this is, you know, a particularly bad drought. What else? What else do people see? Yes, Ma.
In some of those areas, drought has been very frequent over time.
Yes.
So here's control aspect.
Exactly, right? So, and kind of related to that, I want to call people's attention to this legend up here. And this is saying percent of normal, right? So this is compared to, I believe, a 50-year baseline. So we need to have some sort of indication of how severe is this drought, right? Or how severe is this shock? Without that kind of comparison to what's normal, we don't have, we can't really understand, like, how big of a deal is this thing, right? So perspective matters, right? And this is, you know, shocks are experienced differentially. So even if it might be objectively one of the most severe droughts, some households who may not be particularly vulnerable, their livelihoods aren't related to rainfall, they might not be affected as severely as, say, an agricultural or a pastoral household, right? But they could be affected by some downstream effects based on market prices as food prices go up and agricultural production fails. So it really, we really need to understand not only the objective measures of how severe a particular shock is, but also have an understanding, how is this affecting households' lives and livelihoods at the kind of micro level. So we also know that there are various categories of shocks and stresses, right? So we have kind of weather and climatological ones that are related to drought, flooding, could be earthquakes. We have kind of more technological ones like the nuclear reactor in Fukushima. We have man-based ones that are like armed conflicts, terrorism, ongoing violence. Then we have kind of disease, public health risks as well. So it's important to think about what are the various types of shocks and stresses that people are exposed to. And some of these things have, we already have good objective and subjective measures. Some of these things we really don't. And so it's important to understand, as we're planning for data collection, understand which ones do we have those good objective measures for, which ones do we not. Some of these things already have existing information systems around them too, right, that we can take advantage of. So next we have to consider, is it a mountain or is it a molehill, right? So is it something that's affecting a large number of households, or is it something that affects a small number of households, like individual households? In our jargon, this is kind of covariate large shocks or kind of more idiosyncratic micro shocks. But we can't underestimate the micro shocks, right? Because as households, these things, they might be even more common than these large covariate shocks, right? We're always exposed to people losing their jobs, people, primary income earners dying, like gender-based violence. All of these things kind of can accumulate, right, and add up to have a large effect on lives and livelihoods. So just a very quick visual on, in addition to understanding, like, is it idiosyncratic, is it covariate? We also need to understand, is it something that's chronic or is it something that's acute, right? And so this is by no means, of course, a comprehensive list. It's just a means of understanding, like, temporally, what is the frequency, duration of a particular shock or stress, and then is it affecting a large or small number of households? We also know that, like I was saying before, with the cumulative effect of various shocks. So this is something that an objective single measure is not going to tell us much about, right? So this is, like, highlights the importance of understanding at the household level how are various shocks interacting and having kind of multiplicative effects on degrading the household's well-being. So finally, just rules of thumb that I like to keep in mind as we're thinking about what to measure in shock measurement for resilience analysis. Knowing exactly what kind of shocks you want to focus on. And this is in part facilitated through a resilience assessment process, or at least really thinking carefully about understanding what is the multitude of different events that you should be looking for? What are the kind of data sources that are out there? Are there good indicators of this objectively and subjectively? And this is, again, highlights the importance we need to have kind of multiple measures, because if we only are looking out for one particular thing, we're really missing the bigger picture. Again, there's a big temporal aspect, and I think Tim and Tiffany are going to mention this recurrent monitoring and being able to measure change over time. If we just, like, a snapshot is really not enough to tell us about how households' well-being and responses are evolving over time. And then knowing whether or not it's been experienced is only half the battle. So there has to be some degree of how is this really affecting the household? And that's both objectively, like, is this the worst drought they've seen in 50 years or 100 years? Or is this, even if it's not the worst drought, I mean, they can still be, for particularly vulnerable households, this can be super impactful, even for minor droughts, right? This is just to highlight the various types of data sources that are available. Again, this is not a comprehensive list, but I think that the main point here is there is a wealth of information out there, right? So especially at regional and national level, we have just a ton of various data sources that we can draw upon. And again, a lot of these are available for free. And so I think it's something that we need to be better about collecting, like routinely kind of collecting and monitoring this information. Finally, just quick highlight on levels of efforts, right? This is purely indicative, but at a minimum, you should really have an understanding of baseline, end line, what does the situation look like. You're not going to be able to do a lot of primary data collection necessarily, but really, being able to do something with media that requires a little more effort, enables you to have a more comprehensive picture, like measure changes over time, and so like really understanding like whether or not you are having an effect on building resilience. And I think that's it. Yeah, that's fully done.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tim Frankenberger. I'm with Tango International. I'm going to be talking about how we measure capacities. So one of the things about resilience is we're interested not only in the shocks that people are exposed to, but actually how they actually manage those shocks and stresses. So one of the things that we like to make a difference between is you can have the capacity to do something. For example, you can be trained up in a certain profession, and that doesn't mean that you'll get a job in that profession, but you have the capacity to actually work in that profession. So differentiating what people's capacity is and their actual response is important, because they combine different capacities to respond to these shocks and stresses, and not everybody responds in the same way, even though they might have the same set of capacities. So that's really important. We want them to respond in the right way so that they actually can recover, they don't lose too much of their assets, it's not too much of a sacrifice for them. So we're interested in these capacities, and each context, there will be different kinds of capacities that are going to be important. If you're in an area that floods all the time, the kinds of capacities that are key to that are going to be different than if it's a place that's drought, always a drought. So we want to understand the context in which we're collecting this information. We want to understand how people actually are responding, and some responses are not necessarily positive. As we know, people will cut down the food they eat, they might drop their kids out of school, they might actually get into debt. Those are responses that we don't want to encourage. We want to have different positive responses in those. So that's one way that people cope with some of these problems. And we want to actually make sure that we can collect this data in a way that helps us measure whether capacities are getting better and these outcomes that people are trying to achieve are getting better. So a lot of the interventions that your implementing partners are trying to improve on these capacities. Now, what's different between trying to do this resilience measurement around capacities and a normal M&E system? Well, both require very robust monitoring systems, and we're collecting data that is critical for telling us whether or not programs are making a difference. But one of the things that's really important about resilience is that we're looking at shocks and stresses, the stuff that Brad was talking about before.
There you go. Perfect.
Oh,
Perfect.
yeah. Oh, did it skip one?
Yeah.
Sorry. Sorry about that. So M&E systems are still rigorous, but we're looking at different kinds of capacities in relationship to shocks and stresses, indexed to a particular outcome that we're interested in. Okay, and that's exactly what this slide's about. So we're capturing these different capacities. We're looking at it in relationship to the shocks against some kind of well-being outcome measure. What could be food security, could be nutrition, could be some kind of wealth indicator that we're interested in. Now, as already has been said by previous speakers, we're interested in 3 types of capacities. Absorptive capacity, this is people... They can't hear me?
There's some feedback when your speech is.
Looks good, though.
This is why I shouldn't dress up. Anyway, no, I'm off. Okay. Absorptive capacity has to deal with people's ability to manage shocks in the short term. Can they respond in a way that allows them to manage this shock? So a lot of the DRR work that you do is around this. Adaptive capacity, we actually know that this change is there for good, and so we need to actually have our livelihoods adapt to that change. So we're looking at proactive decisions that people are making to actually manage those shocks and stresses. Transformative capacity, these are the enabling conditions that have to be in place, the policies, the regulations, the infrastructure, the changes in cultural norms that are going to allow women to participate more effectively in these opportunities. So these are the transformative things that have to be in place. This is the stuff that takes the longest to change. So when we talk about resilience programming, it may take 10 to 15 years before we see some of these transformative changes happen. But that's the stuff that really makes a difference. We will see absorptive and adaptive changes happen in a 3-year or 5-year period, but this transformative stuff takes much longer. It doesn't mean that we give up on it because we only have a 5-year project. It means that we keep working on it. We have a long-term strategy to try to change these things. Next. All right, the other thing that's important about these capacities is that they're measured at different levels. So we have individual capacities, we have household capacities, we have community capacities, we have higher systems level capacities. And so there are indicators at each of these levels that are important to capture. So we want to know whether or not people are, do they have risk aversion in the way that they think about stuff? Do they actually have access to financial services like credit and savings? Do they have crop insurance? This is at a little bit higher level. Is there health insurance at the national level that could actually use? So we're trying to look at different ways that capacities are used to help people manage these shocks. We also want to make sure that we identify which responses are the things that are going to make the most sense in that particular context and try to build those capacities that actually encourage those kinds of responses. So, for example, if you're trying to bring about some drought-resistant seeds, you not only have to make sure that people have access to those seeds, but the extension system actually can provide those seeds, or that they can actually produce those things in country or nearby countries so that you can actually get it. So you have to think about the different levels of the response that are going to be important. So the thing about responses is that there are 3 different things that we want to take into account here. One is that you're trying to protect people from these shocks and stresses. We're trying to prepare to anticipate these shocks and stresses, and we're trying to act as they actually happen. So when you try to prevent people's exposure to it, that's a lot of the DRR work that you're doing. You might build a dike to prevent people from getting exposed to floods, or you might have storage of grain in good years so that you actually have something to eat in the bad years. You also can prepare or anticipate these shocks by making sure that you have redundancy in some of your urban activities, so 2 bridges instead of 1, so that you aren't dependent on using 1 to get out of an area. The same thing with regards to use of credit, being able to make sure that people have opportunities to diversify so they aren't only dependent on climate risk type activities. So if if you're exposed to a drought and your main livelihood activity is going to be farming, giving people an opportunity to diversify into non-farming, non-climate risk kinds of activities allows them to manage those shocks better. Okay, so we want to think about these capacities in the theory of change. So we have a number of program activities that we implement. We're trying to strengthen these resilience capacities so that we have effective responses to those shocks and stresses so that we can actually see a positive gain in these food security or nutrition outcome measures. So one of the things about resilience capacity versus resilience is this. Resilience is the stability or quick recovery around that outcome measure. So that means food security is maintained even though the shocks are hitting, people are managing. Resilience capacities allow people to do that. They're not the same thing as the actual resilience, though. Resilience is the actual stability of that outcome over time in the face of those shocks and stresses, or quick recovery of that outcome measure in relationship to those shocks and stresses. So it's important from a measure perspective to get that right. We have a number of different data sources and indicators that we're using to collect this kind of information. So this information, baseline, for example, Food for Peace and the Center for Resilience have been supporting these kinds of data collection activities in a number of different countries. We're doing this in Ethiopia, Kenya, Niger, Burkina Faso, many other countries. And so we're trying to make sure that these capacity modules are built into these different surveys that we're doing. Again, we've got different places where we are doing baseline, we are doing midlines, we are doing end lines, but we also have a number of places where we're doing this recurrent monitoring work. And the recurrent monitoring, I think you'll get more into that, but the thing about recurrent monitoring is when we have a shock hit, it allows us to actually understand how people are actually managing that shock over time. And it allows us to also see what the downstream effects of those shocks are. So a drought not only affects people immediately because their crops die, but it has an effect on the market because everybody's trying to sell all their animals at the same time, so the terms of trade get worse for those households. When the prices in the market get worse, then people turn to other types of activities like raiding other people's lands for water and pasture that goes up. So these are interconnected shocks and have a lot to do with people just trying to cope. And so the recurrent monitoring system that we have allows us to do that. All right, I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
So it's me again. I'm going to take the most complicated topic and talk about it in the shortest amount of time. That is done deliberately. So I'm going to talk for about 4 or 5 minutes on resilience analysis. This is where the two pieces that we just heard about, measuring shock and measuring capacities, come together. I'm going to focus on how it's different than traditional M&E without getting into the weeds of the analysis details. If that comes up during Q&A, so be it, we can chat about it, but I didn't want to bog us down into kind of a statistical conversation. I do encourage folks to look at the guidance. Yes, so. Okay, so I always like to start with the blunt, bottom line up front, so you can fall asleep for the next 4 minutes. 3 big ways that resilience analysis is different than traditional M&E. One, instead of tracking thresholds of point estimates over time, we're looking at relationships, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The second is the role of risk, shocks, and stresses. Yes, sorry. And third is related to dynamics. Okay, so let's unpack that. Okay, so traditionally when we're thinking about at least the M part of M&E, right, the monitoring, we have indicators that act as proxies for what we care about, and we look at whether those go up and down over time, right? We want to see hunger going down, food security going up, nutritional outcomes getting better over time. And so we track indicators to align with those outcomes over time. However, in a resilience measurement approach, a resilience approach, we're looking at the relationship between shocks and stresses, resilience capacities, and well-being outcomes over time. And that word relationship means that you have to do some sort of analysis, right? We're not just interested in whether what we think are resilience capacities move up and down over time. We're not just interested in how shocks change over time. What we're interested in is, are the things that our projects are doing, are those things helping households, communities, and systems better manage and respond to shocks and stresses over time, right? So it's this interrelationship between the three that makes resilience analysis more complex than just looking at point estimates over time. And we use mixed methods to do that, as Brad and Tim alluded to. The specific analyses that we use to look at those relationships over time, we use regression analyses, we use growth regression analyses. All of that weedy stuff is in the guidance note. The point is that you need to look at the relationship between the three over time to truly be doing a resilience analysis. Okay. The second, and that it's related to the first, is the role of shock, stresses, and risk, right? So if Ray were here, I'd like copy his talking point where he says, oh, you know, we don't want to say that risk won't happen because we know that it will, right? So risk is forefronted within the context of a resilience measurement approach. We're trying to enable the communities that we're working with to better respond to risk. So we want to measure it, as Brad talked about. We want to measure it objectively. We want to capture how it's being experienced subjectively. And we also want to capture how households and communities are responding to it. So the analysis captures that interrelationship. So we want to forefront risk, measure it, and then see how it plays out across time and space. And then lastly, dynamics. So we hear all the time conceptually, right, that just because recovery happens in the short term, that doesn't mean it's sustainable across time, or what happens after one shock may not be what happens after a number of shocks experienced in a row. So there are all of these dynamic things happening as households experience shocks and stresses. It's not like they experience the shock and then they engage with our programming and then eureka, they're better forever, right? We know that there's a lot of volatility in the experience of shocks and stresses, particularly as vulnerability increases. So we want to capture that dynamic nature to better, to use that information to better respond to shocks and stresses over time. This highlights the value of panel data. So looking at what happens to the same households or the same communities over time, you're able to capture that volatility and then also better understand how that volatility is best responded to. We've done this, as Tim alluded to, through recurrent monitoring surveys where we capture real-time, real as in quotes, because this is real as we're going to get at this time, where we collect data from the same households every other month, for example, over a year as they're experiencing a shock. So it's not, what did you do 2 years ago when you faced that drought? It's last month, how did you respond to that drought? And with the same households over time to better understand their experiences. And as I mentioned, that's through the recurrent monitoring surveys. So we can get into this more, hopefully, during Q&A and during your group work. But I just want to emphasize that the measurement complexity is not for measurement complexity's sake, right? Like, we're not trying to overcomplicate this just because we're going for punishment. We really do believe that the measurement and capturing resilience in the right way leads to better programming and improved folks' lives. So I'll end it there and turn it over to Brad to guide us into the next.
Thank you, Tiffany. In the interest of time, I'm going to just be very brief on the guidance note 5. So as Tiffany mentioned in our intro, we're hopefully going to be releasing this at the end of May. So it's just undergoing the final revision. So look for that soon. But I will plug basically what's in it. So this is really on how do we integrate resilience measurement into our M&E systems? And so this is something that, we've gotten obviously a lot of requests for. There's a lot of demand for this, still trying to figure out how that works. And so we've been developing ways of doing that. And this is, again, as Tiffany mentioned, this is not the be-all, end-all. We're hoping to iterate on this, and so we look forward to feedback on how you are using these guidance notes and what we would, how they can be improved in the future. So do look for that at the end of May. There is a one-page summary outside here, and I think it's available online as well. So do have a look at this if you want to know a little bit more about it, and look for it in the coming months. And finally, resilience, I'm going to give a plug for Mercy Corps. Resilience M&E is definitely a hot topic. We're actually hiring for a position right now. So if you know anyone, or if you yourself are looking for a new job, there's Sonia there, our Director of M&E. You can corner her over coffee, and everyone brought their CV, right? So feel free to reach out to us offline if you're interested. So I think next we're going to go to the group activity, and this is recognizing group activities are very difficult to do, especially when you have a fair amount of people in the room and a lot of people online. The point of this group activity is really to get your creative juices flowing for the question and answer segment. Some people are escaping while they can. Don't worry, it won't be that terrible. So how we're going to do this. You don't have to move around. You just need to kind of situate yourself to talk to your neighbors, make new friends. But if you look underneath your chairs, there will be, it's every other chair or so. It's not an all-expense vacation. It's actually, y'all get a car. No. So if you look under your chair, you should find a piece of paper with a prompt on it and a pen. So I want you to take 5 minutes to discuss with your neighbors this question, take notes, and we'll resume in about 5 minutes. Come back, and I'll call on a couple of people. So go ahead and take 5 minutes to do that. Okay, so what I'd like to do, so first of all, I want to make sure that whoever was taking notes, if you have any big insights or questions for us, you can leave them here with us if you want us to hold on to them. And we are, like we solicited feedback through the registration process, we are actually accumulating this information and using it to guide ourselves in the future. So it doesn't just go in the recycling bin. So what I want to do now is I want to go around the room. We're not going to share everyone's findings because that would just take too long. But I do want to see if anyone who had, so for each of the questions, I'm going to ask one person to share maybe 2 or 3 key takeaway messages that they had in their group. And we're going to do, let's do 2 of the questions in person, and we'll do 2 of the questions online. Okay, does that sound good? So who had question 1 on can you measure resilience in the absence of a shock? If so, how? If not, why not?
Well, we had it, but
you had it.
When we grew, we followed the 3rd bullet instruction, which was if you have multiple questions, choose one, which to discuss. So we took that to mean we have question 1 or question 4, so we went with question 4.
Got it. Okay. So is there anyone that did, who answered question 1, or should we do this online? Is there anyone in the room that answered question 1? Let's go to online then. Who answered question 1 over there? Is there anyone that wanted to share out their top line findings?
Okay. So in terms of the question is, can you measure resilience in the absence of a shock? If so, how? If not, why not? So there was an extensive chat, but it says it may be you can measure existence of risk management measures, e.g. access to insurance, number of insured, diversification of income. And if when targeted shocks are not occurring, you can measure the capacities development outcomes over time. And then looking at how people are applying adaptive capacities. And then at the output level, resilience capacity is an enabler but resilience cannot be measured at the outcome level without a real shock event. So,
Cool. That's great. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, that's great. People were paying attention. All right. So is there anyone in the room that had answered question 2? And I'm going to come back to you for 4, since I know you answered it. All right. Who answered? Anyone in the room that answered question 2 on think of a major or common shock? Yes. Anything to share with the group?
So we actually talked about okay, the question is, think of a major common shock in a country or project you're familiar with. How would you measure the severity of the shock and resilience measurement efforts? Think of the quantitative, qualitative, objective, subjective measures. How much you use this information for analyzing resilience, making programming decisions. Anyway.
You don't have to answer all.
Yeah, so we first focused on one of our projects which has three major shocks or stresses, and that is droughts, floods, and food price spikes. And what we thought is how we would measure them. I mean, I think they definitely could be measured, you know, at the risk level, and also, you know, as they affect households and communities and systems. But what we were thinking is more as how we could analyze this in terms of programming, because we are both program people, we're not M&E people. And we thought of sort of the dynamics around that and how these stresses affect communities in terms of different segments of the communities, like youth, how youth might be affected more in terms of droughts and floods, because they are chronic stresses or chronic shocks and may happen cyclically, so they might not be prepared the first time around, but the second time around they'll be prepared. And then also food price spikes, and sort of what we're doing in terms of you know, programming around that with regard to conservation farming and bioreclamation of degraded lands and that sort of stuff, you know, to counteract those types of shocks.
Great. Thank you. I think we're going to do, let's go to question 3, and we'll take that one online as well. If you can share like 2 or 3 top-line findings.
Yes. The question was, is there a resilience threshold, and how do you know when a community is resilient? And so the, I guess, biggest takeaway is I think it has to be thought of as a spectrum from lower to higher resilience, or less resilient to more resilient, rather than a specific threshold. And then the point where shocks cause little disruption might be a measurement.
Cool. Thank you. And finally, in the room, you had question 4. So 2 or 3 top-line findings.
Yeah, we did have question 4, which was, how do or would you plan for integrating resilience measurement into your M&E or research? And what are some of the biggest challenges you or your organization face? So a good discussion first on the second question. What are some of the challenges, ranging from the what could be very resource-intensive approaches to analysis for resilience measurement, also issues related to scale both of the sources of data, but also the analysis, whether it be at the individual, household, community, or systems level. And then also Mara shared the perspective of Food for Peace, which is doing and utilizing with Tango some resilience analysis for specific purposes under Food for Peace. And so there is a predetermined kind of purpose for that resilience analysis, but she called out some of the differences that exist across contexts, whether it be DRC, Ethiopia, Nepal, and others. So those are just some of the challenges. We didn't make a lot of progress into how you would actually plan for integrating that, but I think, you know, one thing from my perspective at Save the Children is that whereas we may be collecting quite a bit of this information that's applicable for resilience analysis, we need to start with where we are right now, and going forward, just kind of aligning some of that information that we already are analyzing into a resilience analytical framework. It can be resource intensive, but we don't have to have the full model
right from the start. It'll be an iterative process to kind of build these into our systems. Great, thank you, Tom. So those are, I mean, I'm really impressed with the amount of the level of thought, and it's clear there's a lot of energy and enthusiasm in this particular space. So in the last 15 or so minutes, I think we're going to do a Q&A session for the speakers, and if we want to have, let's maybe take questions in threes. We'll do 2 in the room and 1 online. Does that sound good to everyone? And we do have these. Okay, great. So you have the mic there. So let's go ahead. Does anyone have any questions in the room here? We'll start with a couple in the room. Or is it totally clear? There's nothing else to. You have a comment? Okay.
I just wanted to follow up on Tom's point around starting where you are, and just wanted to highlight that I didn't get into this, but you need not collect primary data to conduct a resilience analysis. You can kind of take the principles of resilience measurement and apply it to existing data sets. And we did just that in Malawi, for example, in Zimbabwe, in Nigeria. It's not totally comprehensive. It's not completely complete in terms of hitting all of the capacities that you'd want to hit in an ideal situation, but you can glean really, really important information. So in Nigeria, for example, using existing LSMS data, we were able to identify sources of resilience capacity to conflict that were unique from sources of resilience in the context of drought and other well-being outcomes. So kind of conflict shocks were different than drought shocks, and we were able to extract those capacities and to show those differences. Or in Malawi and Zimbabwe, we also used country data or LSMS data to apply a resilience lens to existing data. You learn what you can, and then in the future you may have more resources to do primary data collection. So don't let not having the resources to collect primary data prevent you from using what you do have and applying the principles that we've talked about.
So no Q's, just A's.
We're mind readers.
No, I think sometimes
Sorry.
we're sitting on a lot of data. We have a lot of baselines and end lines that were carried out for evaluations of your programs. And if you take a resilience lens and relook at that data, even though when you originally collected it, you didn't necessarily have a resilience kind of thing in mind, you'd be surprised how many indicators you already have collected that will give you a perspective on some of these resilience capacities. And so you can actually say quite a bit about things. So we've done this, for example, with the Shahardo project that CARE was implementing in Bangladesh. We reanalyzed the data using a resilience lens, and we found out that local governance and women's empowerment were huge factors that influenced people's ability to manage floods. And so, and that eventually became published in World Development, that paper. So I think, you don't have to go out and right away start building in these modules into all of your data collection. You take a good look at what you already have, use a resilience lens to analyze it, and then you can actually say quite a bit, probably. So I think that's the advantage that we've had with the ZimBack data in Zimbabwe. This is data that's been collected over years and years. We've taken a resilience lens and started looking at that data, and we're actually finding quite a bit of information that can be very useful to the government on what to focus on in terms of programming. So I think that it's something that we sometimes forget about. You kind of do a check, you've done the baseline, or you do a check, you've done the end line, and then you never look at the data again. It sits on somebody's computer forever, and I think it's really important to revisit those things. Yes, Karen?
I just wanted to call out a few questions from group 4. Thanks to all of you. They raise a number of questions that you might be able to address across the panel. Number one, how do you deal with the issue of survey fatigue, especially when you're talking about these recurrent monitoring surveys? And then secondly, some of the differences and objectives between collecting resilience data for research purposes and then the objective of collecting information to help improve projects and activities.
you sort of reconcile those different objectives? And I think that leads to the question then of how do you, use this research and use these findings and integrate that back into our programs and activities. And then the third question that people seem to be struggling with or have raised issues around is how do you match resource strains over the course of a project with this type of robust measurement, particularly related to shocks when you can't anticipate when they're coming. So how do you ensure that you've got resources to do the measurement that you need when the shock occurs? And you can let us know if we captured that. Thanks.
Great. Tim, did you want to speak to the first one on survey fatigue and your experiences in Ethiopia?
Yeah. So when we did the first recurrent monitoring survey, we were actually collecting data on a monthly basis, not every other month. And we knew that might have been too frequent when people started getting guns out and saying, well, we're done talking. So that's why we went to every 2 months instead of once a month. And the other thing that I think is important here that we learned is that you don't necessarily need to do focus groups every 2 months. You can split up doing key informant interviews and then focus groups every other time you go out. So there's a way to kind of disperse the data collection in a way that it doesn't wear your people out. But it's really important to understand that what Tiffany was talking about, the dynamic nature of this. Why we want to collect the data over a whole year is because decisions you make in the rainy season have a huge effect on decisions that you can make in the dry season. If you've already made certain, like for example, if you've used up all your social capital in one season, that social capital is not available for you later when you might need it. And so your choices are heavily influenced over the whole year. And so that's why you want to track this stuff, because not only you might be exposed to the drought, that market shock that you're hitting because everybody's selling all their animals might happen 5 months down the road. And you wouldn't have captured it if you only looked for the shock during that first time. And so that market shock then creates all kinds of other knock-on effects, which could even be worse for the families than just the drought by itself. So, it's important to kind of capture this dynamic nature of how people are coping with those shocks, but make sure you don't wear them out. And the other thing we do is, that baseline questionnaire that might take an hour and a half, 2 hours to collect it from a household. We try to make sure that in recurrent monitoring, we only have a questionnaire that takes 20 minutes. Okay, so you've already got a lot of information because it's panel data. You've already got a lot of information on those households, so you don't need to ask them the same questions of things that aren't going to change much. You just want to know how they're actually coping right now with the existing shocks that they're dealing with and how that's changing over time. So we have a very short questionnaire. We have we disperse the kind of qualitative data that we're collecting over time so that you don't wear your people out.
Yeah. So if we're looking at a more global view, which is what a resilience assessment offers us, ideally within the scoping process and the planning and design phase, you would identify what data gaps exist. This may include data around coping capacities or shocks and stresses, whatever it may be. So what a resilience assessment enables us to do is better humanitarian development coordination and talking with different humanitarian actors, development actors, to understand what data they've already collected, where, and for whom, and what it included. And so, for example, in Northeast Nigeria, trying to work across the cluster system or the sector system, depending on what country we're talking about, really enabling better data sharing platforms and conversations around what data will be collected, so anticipating what surveys may roll out and suggesting piggybacking on broader surveys if they're at the household or community level. But in addition to better coordination and collaboration on past and future surveys, also engaging in more participatory, empowering data collection processes helps with survey fatigue. So engaging in participatory rural appraisal practices like risk and resource mapping adds value to the communities and the households that we're engaging with in a way that sometimes quantitative household surveys aren't able to do. And so really having a mixed method approach, we're able to validate and capture data in rich ways, both qualitatively and quantitatively, is really important for transformational learning within the communities themselves and then across the humanitarian and development sectors.
Okay, so I'll start on the second question, and then other folks can add. But very, very quickly, I would say one of our objectives is to obscure this false divide between research and, creating knowledge for research purposes and creating knowledge for programming purposes. Ideally, they're one and the same. And so we've tried to create a system by which the information we're producing is given to implementing partners as quickly as possible, and that to create a relationship also between the evaluators and the partners so they can work together, right? Like evaluators kind of talk wonky. I think Tango is an anomaly because you were an implementing partner, when you worked for CARE, but evaluators kind of talk one language. Program folks are like, yeah, what do I do differently, right? And it's often the case where they're kind of talking past each other. So we've tried to, the center be kind of an interlocutor between the two, because we try to talk both worlds, but we also try to produce different types of products from the same kind of research arm that speaks to those different objectives, right? So we'll do a technical report, we'll try to extract the key programmatic implications into a short brief, and then we'll have a VTC we'll have a meeting with implementing partners and with USAID program staff so that they, get the findings as quickly as possible. It may take a year to get a report. We don't have a year a lot of times to integrate information into our programming, but the analysis is done. So we'll take the analysis in advance of a full report. We'll have a meeting with implementing partners and donor staff, and then we'll have a conversation that is a challenging conversation, I think, at times, to kind of get everyone on the same page with respect to meaning. But the objective is to have that information being used as quickly as possible. So it's not perfect yet, but I think we are trying to respond to the needs of using information and not having 300-page reports sitting on shelves that no one reads, right? And more importantly, no one uses.
I'm going to quickly answer the third question, and I think we might have time for maybe one more question. Cool. So this is on matching resource strains or basic resource strains and this kind of robust measurement and like all the resources that would go into that. And I think there's a few things I'd say on this. One is in the guidance note series, we use tons of real-world examples, and there's lots of links to various reports, so you can kind of see what you would even get out of investing in kind of this kind of data collection, these kind of systems. The other thing we've done in there is we've also actually, well, before we get to that, I also want to reiterate the point that Tiffany and Tim mentioned. There's already a wealth of data out there that we can mine that doesn't, we don't necessarily need to go out and collect more data. So you can hire a consultant to crunch those numbers for you. The third thing I would say, in the guidance note series, we do try as much as possible to give like different kind of levels of effort of low, medium, and high, and what kind of resources might be required to do that. And so I think what's important is, if you think that your programs are building resilience, you need to have some way of measuring it, right? And sometimes you're going to have the super expensive Ferrari model, and sometimes you're just going to have, very light touch, cheaper models, right? The Vespa, right? Vespas, bicycles, roller skates, whatever you can get your hands on. So I think the main point is like trying to right-size those measurement efforts and matching them to the kind of, if it's a big complex program, you're probably going to need a big complex measurement system. But I think the worst case scenario is, say you're building resilience and you're not measuring it, right? And you're doing nothing to actually try and understand what those dynamics are. Should we take one more question you wanted to have? Yes.
My question is with regard to contributing building capacity to a particular project, particularly in parts of the world where there are multiple donors, multiple projects. There's shared learning in communities where there might be interventions in one village, but another village learns about it and adopts the same practices, either through directly through some assistance or informally through communications. So, you know, my question is how can you measure, you know, and how can you attribute these improved capacities to a given project when there's like no more, as you might say, virgin territory anymore, particularly in some of these countries that we work?
Mm-hmm. Should we do one more question? 2 questions? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, we'll do one more question from the room. Yes.
Thank you. Several presenters talked about the utility of resilience measurement as to formulate a resilience strategy and to build capacities and so forth. Perhaps resilience measurement is a relatively new field, I'm not sure, but can you point to any examples where you've used the results of your assessment to achieve change from the public sector? For example, expanding school opportunities for girls, or installing flood control infrastructure, or more roads to link markets together.
Okay, I'll speak. All right, I'll speak to the first question around attribution. A couple things, I guess, a couple reflections upon that. One, at a big level, right? So when we're talking about these big impact evaluations or population-based surveys, we're actually not really that focused on attribution, right? In instances where we are focused on like the prime impact evaluation or a specific project, which is kind of a constellation of lots of partners still working together, and not even just the partners of that project, but partners of that project working in partnership with government-led systems and the like, our contribution, our attribution still isn't pure. But we do what we can from a design perspective to capture what we can. And so, for example, in Prime, we knew that our activities were concentrated in certain communities, and that we really doubled down our investments in some of those communities, and in other communities we had a lighter touch. It wasn't a pure control, right? It wasn't there's nothing happening in these communities in Ethiopia. We knew that there were certain things happening, but our interventions were more concentrated in some of them. And in every other instance, we controlled for what we could, right? So we matched these communities on everything that was observable. You know, there's a lot that's not observable, but that's another session. And we saw differences, right? So it's not a pure RCT. I think that would be very challenging in most of the environments that we work in. But there are things that you can do from an evaluation design perspective and then a statistical perspective to get as close to looking at differences as possible. Would it fly in terms of like cancer research? No. But do we find measurable differences? Yeah, we've been able to. Does anyone want to?
No, I think that because the Center for Resilience has been trying to encourage missions to combine interventions of their different sectors working together, because the layering is really what our hypothesis is that if you simultaneously work on several of these things that are affecting households, you should see some positive gains in all these different kinds of capacities, which should enable them to manage these shocks and stresses better. And so the PREG program in northern Kenya tries to do that. It tries to encourage multiple projects working together in the same communities. But in some places, they're not, they don't have multiple projects working together. So we will compare low intensity and high intensity type areas to see if our hypothesis is right, that more interventions on, in these different things does make a difference. And so that's what we're trying to do. Now, there are some projects that are trying to do RCTs as well, but that's where you really run into this attribution problem, because even though we try very hard to find out what DFID is investing in, or what the EU is investing in, or what the Japanese are investing in, we don't always have access to all of that information, or which communities they're actually in. And so we try to get it, and we try to take that into account, but we don't always have access to that information. So in the sampling that we're doing right now for northern Kenya, we've got we've mapped out all of the interventions in all of the locales that the program is implementing in. So we're doing the best we can on that regard, but you're absolutely right. We can't control what other donors are doing. So
in 60 seconds or less, Sarah.
Sure, great question. So yes, there are examples of how resilience assessments have developed series of change or strategies, which have then been basically workshopped with national governments and the public sector. The challenge inherently is if we're working within a fragile context and we identify through the series of activities that a lot of the root causes and underlying conditions, systemic constraints, are related to poor governance. Obviously, it takes a lot of treading lightly and diplomacy to share those results, but in northern Uganda, for example, there was a resilience assessment conducted that highlighted a lot of ecological trends and degradation, and this facilitated conversation with government to enable change in policies around natural resource management and support with community-based resource management and conflict reduction within that area as a direct result. But there are other examples that we could share later. Thank you.
I'm going to hand it over to Tom because we're already over time.
Yeah. Thank you, Brad. Thanks to each of the speakers. I realize we are over time. I know that we could keep talking about this for quite some time, but very much appreciate the conversation today. First, I'd like to congratulate Mercy Corps for developing this guidance. It's clearly very much in demand. People are very interested in it. Thank the Center for Resilience for supporting it and providing their insight into this guidance. It's been very, very timely and helpful for all of us, I'm sure. I want to thank all of you for attending today, including those of you who attended online, acknowledging that we didn't really even scratch the surface in terms of the number of questions and points and follow-ups that we might, but we have recorded those. Today's session will be made available, and most importantly, it is going to be addressed again in similar fora like this. Obviously, the real world very much sees the need for interaction as a community kind of trying to push forward on the topic of resilience measurement and analysis. So please stay tuned. There will be follow-up for this session today, including an evaluation. If you could respond to that, we'd very much appreciate it. But also, there will be similar events like this. So we'll keep you all notified of that, and please check the Real Award webpage for similar events in the future. Finally, I'd like to thank USAID, Food for Peace, and OFTA for hosting us in the space today. It was nice to have you all here. And most importantly, or also very important to thank Laura and Julia and Karen for maintaining the thread with online participants, and especially Maya Person and Abila for doing all the organization. Okay. Yes. So their webinars are being planned on the individual guidance note. We, as a real project, we're going to be sending out updates to you soon, and those webinars are going to take a closer look into get into more depth on the content of the individual guidance notes themselves, the how-to, where do we apply it, what is kind of latest thinking, how can we, again, on each of these individual topics, how can we move forward on different aspects of resilience measurement and analysis. Thank you. Thank you. Grab hard copies.